anyway. Okay.
So please repost and like the space so that the word gets out. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so let's well, I'm going to go through chapter 30 and then I have a couple questions for you guys. All right. So, chapter 30 is about Oliver North and the network. So, let's dig in. So one of the guys that papers were used to create this book is a guy by the name of William Corson. And William Corson had he looked like the same haircut and everything else like a Marine. Um, and he had been in Washington for generations. I mean, he's like one of the old timers there. And he came in kind of at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. And so Corson had spent a lot of time, knew the lay of the land in DC. And he ends up going to a hotel in DC called Hay Dash Adams Hotel. And there's a room there called the John J. Room, and Corson was escorted to his customary table because, again, he's been there forever. Everybody knows him. There were few places in Washington in the 1980s that attracted more powerful people than John Hay Room. On any given day, Nancy Reagan or cabinet secretaries or whatever were seen throughout the room. Corson had grown tired of an increasing show that had kind of developed around the people in there with the Reagan administration as they had come in, because again, this is kind of the glitzy Hollywood stuff. And so instead of it being more of a like intrigue kind of thing, you had some people that he thought were kind of the B-list people hanging out in there. So in April 1984, Corson had decided that he was going to go there because he wanted to lend a hand to a former Marine student who had just undertaken an assignment at the National Security Council. Corson wanted to send a message to the assholes in the White House that he had enough regard for fellow Marines to lunch with them in a very visible place. Corson had served 3 presidents on some of the most secret and sensitive missions. In 1958, he had acted as Senator Jack Kennedy's guide when he went to Japan. In Korea, he had saved the life of Allen Dulles' son. He had been sent on an unsuccessful secret mission in 1950 to try to bribe Ho Chi Minh to launch a diversionary attack against China to limit China's help to North Korea. That's interesting because you know who was hanging out in well, he wouldn't have been by that time. Never mind. Corson had returned to Vietnam as the only American on the ground at Ben Vinh Phu and was marched out with the French prisoners after their surrender. So the guy gets around. General von Nguyen Giap sent him back to Eisenhower to tell the Americans that they faced the same fate as the French if they decided to replace them. Corson's accomplishment and candor was legendary. Later in Vietnam and Laos, Corson recruited mountain tribesmen to fight. After the 1961 Laotian Peace Accord betrayed those same troops, a disgusted Corson returned to the U.S. There he worked on one of the most secret operations in American history, unmasking a Soviet agent at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA. In the 1960s, Corson taught constitutional government at the Naval Academy. He was a linguist, an economist, and an accomplished historian. He did not appreciate shortcuts. And that is why in 1966, with thousands of Marines having died in Vietnam, Corson returned to Vietnam to lead the Marines in battle again. There he ran up against Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, and their colleagues, including Klein. And as a result of their efforts, I saw things in the assassination programs and the brutality of their effort that told me that the U.S. was doomed in Vietnam. In 1968, Corson came home from Vietnam convinced that the Pentagon and the CIA had betrayed the American soldiers fighting there. Risking a court martial, he capped his military career by writing a damning expose on the Vietnam War called The Betrayal. Lyndon Johnson withdrew an Article 39 indictment against Corson when reminded of the embarrassing secrets Corson could reveal. Corson became an advisor to government agencies, including the FBI, NSA, CIA, White House, and to Senators Chuck Hagel and Bob Kerrey. Probably no one in Washington knew more genuine secrets than Corson. Marines who had served under his soldier spy leadership ended up in some of the most important jobs in government. Now, another one of Corson's students was following in his career path. That was Marine Major Oliver Ollie North. He wanted to have some kind of political military assignment under Reagan that Corson had had under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy. Corson liked to be seated and ready for his guests. So Corson got there early, and as he sipped a double vodka martini while waiting for North, he recalled the young officer's background. He was worried about how North might be used in his new job. It was a good instinct, and as it turns out, I had real reason to worry. His desire to get what he wanted caused him to shade his perceptions of truth. He never believed he was lying. He just recreated the truth, and that was far more dangerous. North, Catholic, from upstate New York, had always wanted to be a Marine officer. His admission into the Naval Academy was a dream come true. In February 1964, Oliver North and some of his Naval Academy classmates were driving to a ski trip in upstate New York. The car's driver fell asleep at the wheel and hit a truck head on. One of the midshipmen were killed and the others were injured. One of North's knee was shattered. Months of operations and a slow recovery followed. Corson first got to know Oliver North when he was recovering in the hospital. Corson would stop by to visit various students and occasionally contributed beer or other items to their recovery. North brooded over his injury, fearing that it was going to basically render him not eligible to be in the military. And he said that I told North to knock off the Mr. Roberts Act for feeling sorry for himself. There would be enough time to go to Vietnam. North was declared medically unfit to remain at the Naval Academy. Corson said that North had such a strong desire to get back to Annapolis that he was not beyond pulling strings and playing with the facts about his injury. Casey's biographer, Joseph Parinsko, wrote of North during this period. Along with the doggedness, the will to succeed, there emerged a darker side, a willingness to trifle with the facts. His years at an obscure teacher's college after he was dismissed from Annapolis somehow metamorphed into 2 years of pre-med to make sure that his knee problem would not prohibit his dream of being a Marine Corps career officer after Annapolis. One classmate claimed North managed to strip any harmful information from his medical records. North was accepted back at the Naval Academy on the condition that he repeat his plebe year. He was one of the students in Corson's government class. North excelled at boxing despite his knee injury. So Corson went to another student, future Navy Secretary James Webb, who boxed with North at the academy, and asked Webb for a favor. The fight was filmed. Webb and North fighting. They were both lefties. I told Jimmy, I know you can take him out, so just carry him for a few rounds. In effect, Jimmy threw the fight. The film was to show that the commission was shown to the commission that did the physical evaluation. That's what happened. So basically, they staged a fight to prove that North was fine. Corson also knew that North fretted over the potential loss of his military career, and he hadn't even started it yet, and waited for word about getting reinstated at the academy. In the meantime, he had applied to the CIA. Corson, not surprisingly, had received a call from the agency regarding North, who had undergone a battery of tests. He was the perfect guy for Shackley. Oliver would do anything to reach a goal. It was on that contact with the CIA that the deepest, darkest secrets of Oliver North's life would turn. North graduated in 1968, a year later than planned. He achieved his dream of going to Vietnam. He served as a Marine officer while Shackley and his cronies were running the intel war in Vietnam. After that first contact at the Navy Academy, the clandestine services had kept an eye on North. More likely, he may have been actually recruited early on. That willingness to serve as a clandestine officer would not be forgotten, especially by the Bush administration. That is why North got the assignment to the National Security Council. North said in his autobiography that he won a Silver Star for gallantry in action for leading his men to rescue a unit trapped by machine gun fire. Corson had heard quite a different story. A young Marine tank commander named Michael Wansk was lost in battle, possibly because North's unit did not provide the protection that they were there to provide. Corson said Mike got killed 5 days before he was set to come home. The battle was up in the DMZ. Some of North's fellow Marines believed that North didn't do his job that day, and North was the last person to see Mike alive. North made national news when he returned to Vietnam in 1970 as a witness for one of his men, who was on trial for taking part in the Sung Thang killings of 16 women and children. North was a guest on William Buckley's firing line, and William Buckley, by the way, CIA too. After he and two fellow officers wrote Buckley a letter defending the military in the aftermath of the My Lai massacre. In that darkest single moment of a very dark war, 347 women and children were murdered by U.S. servicemen. North later wrote that he had found the experience on the Buckley show satisfying. North was known as a commander devoted to his troops, but very tightly wound, which worried Corson. According to Corson, certain mental and physical problems had been purged from North's medical records. Corson said that in 1974, North suffered an emotional problem. At one point, North was hospitalized after an incident with a handgun. North had just returned from assignment to Okinawa and was committed to the Bethesda Naval Hospital for several weeks. Because North had been involved in post-nuclear war planning, he had the highest security clearances. Corson said that North went to great lengths to keep details of his illness out of his medical records. That would be interesting to know what those links were. After distinguished service in Europe, North received a coveted assignment to the Navy War College. where he came to the attention of Navy Secretary John Lehman, who recommended him to Richard B. Allen, who was briefly Reagan's national security advisor. Allen's short tenure there was part due to North. In late 1981, North was plucked from the Naval War College to serve on the National Security Council. I had no business being assigned to the National Security Council, North later wrote. I was in over my head. As North pointed out, he held no advanced degree in foreign policy or political science. All he had was his military experience, and he knew that was not enough. So North began to read everything he could about foreign policy. He wanted to make a good impression. North got ahead by working excruciatingly long hours and brown-nosing his boss. North's first job for Richard Allen was to set up charts and easels for people's meetings. Allen said, after a year in the office, he was close to Bill Casey, but not particularly popular with George Bush or with Shackley's private enterprise network. Allen did not like cowboys and was even less comfortable with Bush off-the-books operations. It was not long before Allen began to disagree with people from the Bush's shop and found himself in jeopardy. North ended up as the man who put the finger on Allen and the final dagger in his back. North opened a safe in an office that had been assigned to Allen during the presidential transition period. In the safe, North discovered an envelope containing $1,000 in cash, several bottles of liquor, and 2 expensive watches. Japanese magazine journalists had given Allen these items as a thank you gift for interviews with Nancy Reagan. North took the items over to Jerry Jennings, who ran security for the NSC, and in short order, the incident was leaked to the press. Allen was crucified in the press, and he was gone. And let me explain something to you guys, which speaks to this, and it gives you a little inside baseball. So it is not unusual when government officials go overseas and they get gifts, because you also give gifts. And it is also not unusual that, I don't know about $1,000 where it came from, but a lot of time you do have cash when you're at that level to travel on, because some of the places you go only takes cash. So that's not even really that worrisome. But when you come back, because those items have to be registered, like I can talk specifically about the SecDef, William Perry went to Saudi Arabia and got a solid gold gun that actually worked. Solid gold gun. And what happens is, when they come back, they're put in a safe and they're added to an inventory. And then the principal who got them can display them in his office, or they stay in the safe. When they get ready to leave office, because a lot of times they'll, especially if they're there for a while, they'll redecorate and they'll go take things out and put other things back in and blah, blah, blah. When you leave, there is a fair market value placed on all of those gifts, and you can actually buy those gifts and take them with you. Or you can leave them and they go into like a museum or a library or something like that, because they are technically government property. So without knowing anything more about this was them trying to get rid of him because he started asking questions, the national security advisor, not unlike what they did with General Flynn, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with you having those things in your safe, especially if they're part of, as this was a very new administration, and they probably had not been inventoried yet. Casey wanted Reagan to appoint a Democrat, Jeane Kirkpatrick, as Allen's replacement, but instead James Baker and Mike Michael Deaver persuaded Reagan in January 1982 to appoint a judge by the name of William Clark, a man who knew almost nothing about intelligence or foreign policy. When Clark had been appointed as Deputy Secretary of State for African Affairs, Senator Joseph Biden had humiliated him by demonstrating during a hearing that Clark had no idea who the leader of Zimbabwe or South Africa was. And I can guarantee you Joe Biden didn't know either until he studied up for the meeting. On January 2nd, 1982, Colonel Robert Bud McFarland became Clark's deputy, and Oliver North, as McFarland's assistant, was on his way. Now, McFarland, Oliver North, John McCain, and John Poindexter were all at the academy around the same time. So was Webb, the Navy secretary. There is a book called The Nightingale Song, and that book is about those guys and their tenure at the Naval Academy. It is a very interesting book, by the way. On January 2nd, let's see, a small group of Marine officers who had served with distinction in Vietnam, I don't know what kind of distinction, but whatever, because nothing there was impressive. They were tapped for foreign policy or clandestine intelligence assignments. Bud McFarland had emerged from the original Marine landing at Da Nang to become Henry Kissinger's military aide in 1973 with the help of his mentor, Nixon, Marine aide Colonel Jack Brennan. Now McFarland took North under his wing, as Brennan had done for McFarland. One of Brennan's cronies, Lieutenant Colonel James Tully, Tully, became a friend of Oliver North. Tully, who had a knack for making money, was also a close friend of General Richard Secord and Ted Shackley. North did not know it at the time, but he was being brought into an inner circle of a private intelligence network. Marine Brotherhood was not the only thing that made North an up-and-comer. North had a habit of name-dropping and complimenting people he worked for, sometimes to the point of making it obvious he was a brown nose. But those who worked with North said what they found most fascinating about him was a lifelong habit of lying about everything. It doesn't mean that he lacked courage. It just meant that he was a hustler. He had the same ethical character Corson had seen in Shackley. He exaggerated his role at the NSC. He claimed to be on the phone with Henry Kissinger when he was not. He told a colleague he had dined with Jeane Kirkpatrick, only to have Kirkpatrick deny it. Casey's office in the old executive building was on the third floor along Spook Alley. Between North's office and Casey's were the Intelligence Oversight Board and the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. That is where North first began running into Bill Casey. Some of his colleagues said it was deliberate. Uniforms were rarely worn by officers at the NSC, but North still had his military bearing in his off-the-rack civilian suit, because you can tell because of their haircut. As he walked across Lafayette Park to meet Corson for their lunch, North was fully aware that he was meeting with a man who had been a great success at the White House. When North had called Corson and asked to have lunch, the teacher originally had declined to meet him at the White House mess. The conversation they would be having needed to be had in a private place, not one that would tell the Washington world that the young Lieutenant Colonel North, knew enough to seek out good counsel. North was full of heady stories for Corson as he sat down. Corson liked North, but realized this promising young man was swimming with fish so big that he thought they were part of the landscape. At first, he was flattered and awed at the proximity to these guys. He thought he'd had him figured out. He thought he was playing poker with the big boys. But Corson repeatedly warned North, people like you and I play one role, and that's to be expendable. I don't think he ever really understood what I was telling him. Oliver North is no intellectual. He is a man who picks up things superficially. Ronald Reagan used that to play people. North told Corson that the administration was running a series of secret operations out of the NSC, that Bill Casey and George Bush were both so frustrated by the reluctance of the State Department and the Defense Department to do anything that with countries like Saudi Arabia, they were conducting off-the-book operations. Corson looked up from his meal and asked Oliver North which spooks, because he made a reference to retired ones. North told him how Brennan, Tully, Shackley, Secord, Klein, and von Marbach had been helpful. It was then that I realized what was happening. These dumb bastards got sucked into the old Ed Wilson crowd. Shackley, Secord, Klein. The administration had let these guys in the tent, and it was only a matter of time before they were going to own the. He tried to warn North about the character flaws in the men that he was dealing with, but all I could do was hope that Oliver North would get burned and back away before the whole thing fell apart. Preaching to him just caused him to shut you out. At subsequent luncheons, Corson found out that North was handling private money and unvouched for black ops funds. They told me not to keep records of any of the money, North said. Corson's penetrating eyes looked across the table at him. With a half smile, he said, quote, when I was paying out millions in gold to hire the Hill people to fight for me in Laos, I was under the same instructions. I came home and there were accusations of missing unvouchered funds. They stopped when I pulled out a small dime store notebook that had everything written down on it, unquote. North walked down to a stationery store and bought some notebooks. Just as Corson had instructed him, North began to mark down every phone call, every meeting, every expenditure. After the Iran-Contra operation became public, the notebooks, heavily censored, became part of the official record. References to lunch with WC are a regular feature in the note-taking, and that is Corson. Also, Oliver North's notes in Oliver North notes are Corson's warning about Bush, Shackley, Secord, Klein, Wilson, and their cohorts. North knew that Corson had been through it all himself with the same cast of characters, but the altitude was too high, Corson said, and Oliver North would not give up and would not ask for reassignment. I told him it could all end only one way, but he just wouldn't give up. William Casey liked North a great deal. He quickly introduced North to a select group of players, and Casey trusted in the CIA, a small cadre led by the one-time station chief in Rome, Dewey Claridge. Claridge, who was a Rome station chief, had had a special interest in Libya, along with Ed Wilson. One of the few remaining traditional secret operatives the agency still employed, Inman watched as Kerry created a secret service within a secret service. Inman never had enormous faith in human intelligence reporting and had a clear understanding of what Shackley and his colleagues were up to. The number 2 man under Casey understood that if something went wrong with the off-the-books operation, the real CIA was going to be blamed for it all. All right, let me see if I can get through most of this next one. Because this is talking about some of the actual off the books. The Reagan-Bush administration used the private intelligence network for the foreign policy activism for almost 5 years before the consequences began to pile up. The first major problem had been Eatzko's investigation, but the incarceration of Ed Wilson and the assassination of Anwar Sadat basically hid most of the loose ends. The first congressional suspicion about administrative activities surfaced as early as December 1982 when questions rose about America's involvement in the Iran-Contra war. It got to the point just before Christmas of 82 that Massachusetts Congressman Ed Bolin, a lifetime friend of intelligence services, took action. Bolin had heard of the secret aid going to the death squads and that they were funding Somoza's regime. The democratically controlled House passed the Bolin amendment that forbid covert aid going to the Nicaraguans and to the Contras. So the diversion of military and foreign aid were taking place from Egypt and Israel to Central America, Africa, and Afghanistan. These activities were staggering in scale. The supply lines to feed the violence of the Iran-Iraq war required a huge pipeline. The Israeli efforts to supply Iran became so formal that the Secretary of State was notified in advance of major arm transfers from Israel to Iran. Out of this initiative came a secret Israeli effort called Demav, D-E-M-A-V as in Victor, A-N-D. That would be the heart of the Iran-Contra scandal. For Sarkis, the first inkling of the Reagan administration in Israel had embarked on a secret program to arm both Iran and Iraq in their brutal, bloody war came to his attention in a Geneva dinner meeting at a high-level Israeli official in 1983. They confirmed what I suspected, that the Israelis had done business with Iran under the Shah and were doing business during the revolution. Sarkis said in a 1988 Texas lawsuit, one guy by the name of Will Northrop, Northrop, gave sworn testimony that he had served as a counter-espionage specialist and colonel in the Israeli military intelligence. He said that the joint CIA-Israeli operation was codenamed V as in Victor, E as in Echo, /Golf, Golf. Northrop testified in 1983 that the arms were being shipped to Iran through dealers in Israel like Ian, I-A-N, Smiley, S-M-I-L-E-Y. Northrop said in an affidavit that the Reagan administration had a second project codenamed Condor, /Demavand, D-E-M-A-V-A-N-D, to sell the arms out of known NATO supplies and supply spare parts from U.S. manufacturers through European subsidiaries. According to Sarkis, the U.S. replenished Israel's arsenal of U.S. weapons and parts to help Iran keep the Shah's old U.S. weapons stock intact. The reports detailing the Israeli sales, that they were literally daily, according to a high-ranking intelligence official in the Reagan administration. In March 1982, Senator Charles Percy, head of the Foreign Relations Committee, actually wrote Under Secretary of State James L. Buckley about the secret agreement violating the 1952 Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement with Israel. Buckley claimed that Israel, quote unquote, assured him the agreement would not be violated. We continue to welcome any evidence concerning this or other allegations, but clearly cannot make judgments on the basis of press reports, Buckley would tell Percy. The powerful Israeli political lobby took Percy's actions as that of an enemy of Israel, and the popular politician once talked about a presidential candidate found he was no longer even a viable candidate for Congress. The anti Marxist campaign in Nicaragua, started by President Carter with a small grant to fund opposition media in 1980, had grown into a full fledged war. And there was no Marxist there, by the way. So the US was clearly on the side of the death squads that were opposing a democratically elected Sandinista government. But in this book, these CIA assets describe it as a unappealing Castro-backed Sandinistas. The Israeli government was also a partner in this effort. The administration was at first split on how to support Nicaragua. Sarkis had been supplying the popular independent Eden Pastora, better known as Comandante Zero. Sarkis, who had been doing everything he could to help Pastora, was surprised when he received a call from Robert McFarlane, the deputy national security advisor. McFarlane told him that the arms dealer needed to back off. He said, I could, let's see, the administration did not take Pastora's independence. They wanted to control the arms flow into the Contras. William Corson warned Oliver North that this whole thing would blow up in his face. Of course, what I did not know was the games that were all being played in the raising of the money. The idea that they would try to link all these operations together and put on a dog and pony show for contributors was operationally insane. How could you expect to keep all of that secret? Corson became even more worried when his friends in the DEA told him that cocaine was being imported to the US by both sides in the war to raise funds. Private funding for the Afghan rebels and Christian money through UNITA, which is in Angola, by the way, and Jonas Savimbi fighting also became administration priorities. So they're fighting in Iran, Iraq, they're fighting the Contras and Sandinistas, and then they decide they're going to fight in Angola too. But Reagan was the best president ever. Tom Clines and the private network helped Oliver North use all of his connections to operate all over the world. Remaining at the center of it all was Ted Shackley, but other familiar faces began circling around, like Richard Secord traveled the world exploiting all of his old Iranian contacts. His former boss, von Marbach, ended up working with Frank Carlucci at the short-lived Sears World Trade, which was a company that was a front for the CIA. According to Roderick Hill, who was a lawyer who had been an intelligence aide to Gerald Ford, he's the one that told everyone about the Sears World Trade. Now, these World Trade, that's the one that was in Chicago. If you guys remember, there was one in New Orleans too that was at the center of the CIA operation there, because the way those World Trade organizations work in these other cities like Chicago, and they're like the hotbed for bringing in the illicit goods. Like the one in New Orleans was bringing in basically coffee that was bought on the black market from Latin America. And they brought in and resold bananas and then marked them as having spoiled on the way up. This was what United Fruit did. So if they had like a 10% loss in the bananas on the way up, those 10% were sold on the side to generate cash. These World Trade marts, there was like 4 of them. And then there was one, Pimerdex, that we talked about in Whitney Webb's book, that all of this shit happens at. They're just fronts. Okay. Hill said that he was shocked to see that Carlucci hired von Marbach when we all knew that he was under criminal investigation. When I went down to the Sears World Trade office in Washington across from the National Archives, the place looked like a spook central. I was supposed to be Carlucci's boss, but I soon found out who was the actual boss. Carlucci was answering to a higher authority, and I didn't even know it. In the early 1980s, George Bush helped Shackley get established in Kuwait and in the oil business as a consultant. Shackley started Theodore Shackley and Associates and several other front companies, which he used as a cover for his work with Bush. For the first time in his life, he was making large amounts of money. With Wilson locked away for the next 52 years, there were no immediate threats to Shackley's future. He even told friends that he still had hopes of becoming the DCI. The administration and admiration of Israel by the neocons was shared by Ted Shackley. One of Shackley's friends and business associates was a guy by the name of Michael Leeden, Ledeen. He was the State Department terrorism expert and consultant to the Reagan National Security Council. Leeden had ties to Israel, specifically Israeli intelligence, which many also had ties to Iranian middleman Menachem Ghorbanifar, who we've come across multiple times because he's the weapons dealer partner with Aden Khashoggi. Even after Ghorbanifar failed a polygraph test that the CIA gave him, Leeden persuaded Casey to trust him as a middleman, who once was described to CIA intelligence chief Charles Allen as great fun. Because, that's a quality you want in your spies. Lawrence Walsh, the Iran-Contra special prosecutor, wrote in his book, Firewall, quote, Leeden was more than a messenger. He had pressed McFarland to open discussions with Shimon Peres and had become the Washington spokesperson for Israeli arms merchants and Ghorbanifar, which is huge because we were doing a lot of business in Israeli, with Israeli as our arms dealer. It was Leeden who would use Shackley and his influence with Bush to orchestrate what would become known as the Arms for Hostage scheme with Israel as a partner. Leeden was a certified good guy to the private intelligence network. He had lobbied hard against the prosecution of Tom Clines and Richard Secord over Eatsgo in 1984. Leeden and Shackley had become partners in dragging the administration into the Iran-Contra scandal. Bush, I'm not sure they drug him, but whatever. Bush counted on Shackley to keep the door open to the Iranian government. On a trip to Los Angeles in 1984, Shackley used Novzar Razmara, and I'll spell his name, Novzar. His last name is Razmara. He worked for the Savak, which is their special police. And he introduced him to Menachem Hashemi, Hashemi, who also was a Savak general who had been visiting London, where he lived in exile now that the Shah wasn't there. Hashemi quickly got the impression that Shackley had a very close connection to Bush and was advising the government on Iran. Hashemi told Shackley that while he had a few contacts in Iran, he would try to accommodate him. 5 months later, Hashemi arranged for a meeting in Hamburg, Germany. So this is November 1984. Shackley met Hashemi at the Four Seasons Hotel in Hamburg. Hashemi introduced him to Ghorbanifar. He also was a Savak agent and an arms dealer. Ghorbanifar opened the 3-day negotiation with Shackley by suggesting that the U.S. trade some tow missiles for some Soviet military equipment captured by Iran and Iraq. He then suggested that the 4 hostage captured by terrorists in Lebanon could be traded through Iran in exchange for cash. Because one of these hostages was Shackley's old friend and colleague, William Buckley, the station chief at the Beirut CIA office, Ghorbanifar got Shackley's serious attention. Shackley would later deny that he had told Hashimi or Ghorbanifar that he was in Hamburg in any official capacity. But Shackley did not deny that he had wrote an urgent memo about his meeting with Ghorbanifar, which he had distributed throughout the State Department and the Vice President's office. Before he left Germany, Shackley met with CIA officials at Frankfurt base, which informed him that Ghorbanifar had a history of failing agency polygraph tests and fabricating information. So, according to William Corson, none of it mattered to Shackley. He proceeded to recommend to use him as a conduit, and he did it because Israeli intelligence suggested it. Shackley's reputation and influence with the Bush as vice president overcame any agency objections to Ghorbanifar. Shackley's memo was delivered to Lieutenant General Vernon Walters, who worked at the State Department. Michael Leedon later said in May of 1985 that he asked for and received a copy of the memorandum and gave it to Oliver North, without, he claimed, ever reading it himself. BS. The result, despite the CIA's reluctance to deal with Ghorbanifar, was that Israel, acting as an intermediary, actually provided tow missiles to Iran. However, William Buckley's life was not spared. Buckley was killed after being tortured by intelligence services. There's some disparity in people's account of who actually killed him. Buckley gave up the names of hundreds of CIA agents around the world during the torture. That's been alleged. Meanwhile, Bill Casey had brought his longtime intelligence associate businessman William Zilka, Zylka. Casey asked Zilka to work with the same Iranian businessman who had facilitated the October surprise meeting in Spain. The shipments to Iran continued for the next 17 months until the Iranians decided to embarrass the administration and leak out the story to a small Lebanese publication. What became known as the Iran-Contra affair involved 2 secret Reagan administration policies that were coordinated by the National Security Advisor and his staff, along with the CIA, and using former CIA and defense officials that had all worked with Ed Wilson. Ted Shackley, through a series of meetings with associates in the Iranian government, began the process that would become the greatest scandal of the Reagan administration. As Wilson watched the years begin to go by in prison, von Marbach, Tom Clines, Richard Secord, Ted Shackley all participated in a scandal that the congressional record would later conclude had its roots in the Reagan's campaign contact with the revolutionary regime in Iran. The official report by Congress concluded that the Iran operation involved efforts in 1985 and 86 to obtain the release of American hostages in the Middle East as a reason for doing the Iran part of it. Now, after doing so much research into this subject, because there was never a single hostage ever released, I'm not so sure that that wasn't a cover story that they were using in order to do the arms thing, so that if it ever got exposed, there was supposedly some tear-jerk humanitarian reason that they could all hang their hat on. The official report by Congress concluded that the Iran operation involved efforts in 1985 and 86 to obtain the release of Americans and the sale of U.S. weapons to Iran despite an embargo. And the same was true with the Contras because that too was embargoed. Not embargoed, but prohibited by law. The Iran and Contra operation were merged when funds generated from the sale of weapons to Iran were diverted to support the Contras in Nicaragua. Although this diversion may be the most dramatic aspect of it, it is important to emphasize that both Iran and Contras violated U.S. policy and law. The ignorance of the diversion asserted by President Reagan in his cabinet is absurd. The secrecy concerning the Iran and Contra activities was finally pierced by events that took place thousands of miles apart in the fall of 1986. The first occurred October 5th, 86, when Nicaraguan government soldiers shot down an American cargo plane that was carrying military supplies to the Contras. The one surviving crew member, American Eugene Hassenhoff, was taken into captivity and stated that he was an employee of the CIA. A month after Hassenhoff was shot down, President Reagan's secret sale of U.S. arms to Iran was reported by that Lebanese publication. The joining of these two operations was made public by November 25th, 1986, when Attorney General Meese announced that the Justice Department officials had discovered that some of the proceeds from the Iranian arms sales had been diverted to the Contras. When these operations ended, the exposure of the Iran-Contra affair generated a new round of illegality, beginning with the testimony of Elliot Abrams and others in October 1986, and continuing through the public testimony of Caspar Weinberger on the last day of the congressional hearings in the summer of 1987. Senior Reagan administration officials engaged in a concerted effort to deceive Congress and the public about their knowledge of and support of these operations. Independent counsel has concluded that the president's most senior advisors and the cabinet members of the NSC participated in the strategy to make national security staff members McFarland, Poindexter, and North, all Navy Academy graduates, along with John McCain. And you know what's interesting about all of this? That we just recently found out about that International Republican Institute. During this whole time, John McCain's running that State Department / intelligence slush fund that was set up during the National Endowment for Democracy legislation, where they gave the Republicans and the Democrats a slush fund. He's running their slush fund for the Republicans at the IRI during all of this, while his classmates from the Naval Academy is doing the Iran-Contra. And no one ever talks about that. No one ever makes that connection. That's crazy. It is, in an important sense, this strategy succeeded. The independent counsel discovered much of the best evidence of the cover-up in the final year of active investigation, which was too late for prosecutions on purpose. The national security reason, much of what became known as the Iran-Contra never emerged publicly. In the thicket of ironies, only Tom Clines ended up in prison, and that was for not reporting the income off of his activities from the fake companies. His friend and Iran-Contra associate, Richard Secord, escaped jail. The political price of running off-the-books intelligence operations had been avoided for years. Hey, stop it. The panic in the National Security Council over the 1981 EATSCO probe caused Reagan to throw a protective blanket over the men who had taken over Wilson's private operations and were running them for the Reagan-Bush administration. When in the fall of 1986, the Iran-Contra operation became public, the exposure tied the top Reagan administration officials to the tawdry illegal arms operation that demonstrated that Reagan announced policy of not negotiating with terrorists was a big fat lie. The scandal would dominate the news for the remainder of the Reagan-Bush administration. During the independent counsel's probe, 14 people were charged criminally. Clines and Secord were charged with operational crimes that dealt with illegal use of profits generated from weapons trafficking. The second part of the criminal investigation focused on the massive cover-up that the administration members took part in. The independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, never used violations of the Arms Export Control Act or the Boland Amendment to charge them. And they were hands down guilty of both of them. Because they were not criminal statutes, and basically they felt wouldn't be the best avenue to take. But I think convicting someone of those types of things because they were guilty of them would actually add teeth to them. In the end, everyone Walsh charged was convicted, with the exception of a single CIA officer whose case was dismissed on national security grounds. 3 top Reagan officials, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, Deputy National Security Advisor Elliot Abrams, along with CIA officers Duane Claridge, Alan Fiers, Fiers, and Claire George, received never before granted pardons by President George H.W. Bush on December 24, 1992, following his re-election loss of the previous month. According to the congressional record, 2 of the convictions were reversed on appeal on constitutional grounds. In the midst of the Iran-Contra, Casey continued to pursue high-risk covert operations with the help of the private network without even consulting the White House. In late 1986, Zilka brought Casey an opportunity that he could not resist. Zilka had connections to a well-positioned religious figure who had influence in the North Korean government. Famine had threatened to engulf the country, and the intermediary told Zilka that North Korea's supreme leader was open to the possibility of a secret meeting. That could not have come at a more critical time. North Korea was trying to decide if it had to make an investment in a nuclear weapons program. According to the go-between, who wishes to remain anonymous, the North Koreans had been approached by Pakistan, who had offered to jointly develop with them a nuclear weapon. Because North Korea was already assisting Pakistan with nuclear capability, a deal could be struck to have the missile program offset part of the cost for the nuclear effort. They, the North Koreans, feared that their economy could not take the cost. After all, the only real enemy they perceived was the U.S. If a deal could be made with Washington on a peace treaty, all of that expense could be avoided. Casey gave Zilka permission to make the trip if someone with great credibility could travel with him. Casey selected retired General Earl Koch, C-O-C-K-E, who was a World War II hero and a former head of the American Legion. He had also been, in the 1970s, head of the Washington's office. I knew that name. Nugent Hand Bank. A few months later, in 1987, the North Koreans sent word that the trip was on. By then, Koch had suffered from a serious prostate problem, and his doctor did not want him to travel before he underwent surgery. To complicate matters, although Casey was impatient for them to go on a trip, neither Koch nor Zilka could get a meeting with Casey, who was dealing with the unraveling of the Iran-Contra. So think about that for a second. Nugent Hand Bank's the CIA front bank. Koch is the head of the Washington one, which means he's CIA affiliated. That's who they're going to supposedly send to North Korea. Casey was also seriously ill from cancer himself. The CIA itself was undergoing a siege because of the Iran-Contra scandal. Despite the danger and lack of direction, Koch and Zilka set off on their secret mission. Their weeks in North Korea were more successful than they expected. General Koch said North Korean intelligence had already discovered that much of the hardware for Pakistan's nuclear program was actually directly from the United States. Then, because you know who was facilitating that? Their other crooked bank, BCCI, which is why this is all really weird, because BCCI is a CIA bank, and they're giving the material to Pakistan to work with North Korea. So none of this is adding up. Sounds more like they're making up a story to try to divert attention and get a quick win. The North Koreans would provide written proffers of further negotiations if the meetings went well. Subsequent contact would be run unofficially through the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. What? William Wilson, who, of course, was part of the CIA as well. Yeah. The North Koreans offered in writing to begin to negotiate not to develop a nuclear weapon in exchange for $1 billion in a loan. However, because no one in the Reagan administration or the Bush administration ever followed up on the trip, the North Koreans assumed that the U.S. was basically moving on. The consequence of that missed opportunity would be that North Korea had a growingly more modern nuclear program. I'm going to leave that there because I don't know how much of that I believe. That sounds like a cool story to try to redeem some people. But anyway, that's it. The next part of this is appropriately called the shakedown. And we're almost at the end. So let me see. I think we may be able to get it done tomorrow if Isabella doesn't come. Otherwise, we'll finish it up the first part of next week. We will only have a show on Monday. We will not have a show on Christmas Eve or Christmas. And then Warhamster and I will be back on Thursday to do our next increment of the secret societies. So it's now open. Anybody want a mic? Come on up.
Well, come on, people. Don't be shy. I know people got questions.
What happened to Bridget?
I have no idea, Colonel. I see her over here as a listener.
I know. I just moved her back up. Let's see. There's Trump Frog. So, Bridget. Bridget.
Sorry, my refrigerator broke and I ended up a little preoccupied, but I was listening. I was lurking.
A little preoccupied. Oh my God, everything's gonna, yeah. I know those kind of emergencies. So I just wanted your feedback from the interview that we did with Ryan Mata that didn't go anything like I thought it would. I really wanted to interview him, and he ended up interviewing me.
Yeah, that's what, I mean, he was putting, it seemed as though to me that he was putting pieces together that he didn't know were pieces. And he was, he was very interested in the timeline, and I really look forward to you guys doing the second part too.
Yeah, me too.
Because I think he's putting together pieces that he didn't even know were part of you know.
Yes. So well, a couple of things. Obviously, an investigative reporter is going to travel to the area. So who is it that gives people their situational awareness briefing when they travel to a foreign country, when they are investigating the very, oh my gosh. Hold on just a second. My husband walked out in the backyard and these dogs are going crazy. The one hides under the footstool and then the other one goes crazy. All right. So when you go to a foreign country on a business trip in the military, you get a threat briefing. And when you work at a combatant command, the senior officers get like literally a trip book that has everybody you're going to talk to, what all their backgrounds are. And when you're not any of those and you're an investigative reporter and you don't know anything about Operation Gladio or Operation Condor and all of the nuances of the international unions are infiltrated with the CIA, the international media is infiltrated with the CIA, and you start rattling these things off, anybody telling you that, they're going to look at you and think you're crazy. And you can get your aluminum foil out and just start wrapping it around your head, because that's literally what it sounds like. And yet we found evidence of all of it in CIA documents. None of that's made up. And so I have a fear for anybody that is operating in any one of the spokes on our wagon wheel, weapons, investigating weapons trafficking, investigating the drug trafficking, investigating the human trafficking, that if they don't understand that they're on the wheel and that they are looking at a spoke in a wheel, they just think they don't know anything about all the rest of the parts. And if they don't understand all the pieces of the wheel, they're likely to get ran over by the wheel. And, I wanted to talk to him to basically explain all of that. And then, of course, to bring what he has found in the context of all of that to you guys. Because we all desperately care about these missing kids. And, I wanted a call to action. I want to know how we can support his efforts. And ironically enough, we didn't even get to that part because he was blown away. And again, I have to say this, for an investigative journalist who gets focused on a subject area, it is very easy to miss all of the other relevant pieces to a much bigger, because you can't, it's like eating an apple. You have to eat it one bite at a time. And so unaware of the danger that you're walking into without knowing where all of the other landmines are, I just wanted to give him a map. And we spent a lot more time drawing the map than we did talking about his subject area. So we definitely will regroup and
it goes to show you how relevant this history is and how it changes. I think he was starting to get a real view of what he had walked through and been. Again, it goes back to things that you think are irrelevant at the time. All of a sudden, once you start seeing the history and the actors involved, it suddenly becomes very totally, he's given his new set of gladio glasses. I guess you could say that. And now he's starting to see things through a totally different perspective.
And what was interesting, and I don't know if you guys were able to see, if you were watching on Rumble, he was taking notes and doing research live. So he's looking up things as I'm talking, basically, which I have no problem with. When you talk about, because again, I sound like I'm crazy every time I say this stuff. I'm fully aware of how crazy it all sounds. That I do the same thing when I'm talking with people, and Alpha does that when we do our Wednesday night show. I'm very comfortable with anybody fact checking anything that I say, because before I'm going to say it to you guys, I fact checked it. Bridget's fact checked it. Generally, cousin it's fact checked it, and we've collectively worked through. Because some of the crap that you come across, you're like, there's no way that's true. You just want to throw that out as an outlier, only to find out that there's a whole nother hole to go down, because not only was it not an outlier, it moved the entire research project. And like, I know I keep using it, but it is so true. The World Anti-Communist League, that to us was an outlier. That was they use that, to hide meetings. They use that as just kind of an umbrella thing. And it's like a club association or something like that. But once you dig into it, it moves the entire research project into a bigger mushroom or a bigger rabbit hole, because not only was it not just a trade association, it was one of the major arteries of the entire operation, which included the terrorist training camp in Taiwan. That's how we found that. And all of that other stuff. And the fact that the entire network is all fascists and Nazis, and they were all war criminals that were working through this entire operation. It wasn't just intelligence people. This was an entire operation by leftover fascists that our government allowed to walk away from military tribunals that they should have been hung in, which is exactly what our government's doing right now. Reaper, go ahead.
Hello, Colonel. Thank you so much for bringing me up. I just wanted to let you know that we have a little bit of breaking news. I posted the receipt in the
Did we lose you?
Shocked, but with how googly-eyed and lost they are half of the time, I can't say that I am, but very sad indeed.
So Reaper, you cut out as soon as you said you posted something. The rest of what you said got cut out.
Oh, that's not surprising. The Biden administration has come out and said that they have no idea how many of our soldiers are in Syria. I would be shocked, but with how lost they are, I can't say that I am, however, very sad indeed. It says Biden administration admits they have no idea how many American soldiers were in Syria.
So that's a big fat lie, because you are now talking what I did in the military for the better part of my career. Every single person that leaves their duty station to deploy has what they call PIDs that you deploy on, that says exactly where you're at. And when you get to that location and you are forward deployed from that location, that is also updated. I could pull a product on any given day, and I could tell you, even for the spec ops, that is in a special computer system, but they do it as well. There's nobody anywhere that someone doesn't know about. So
Yeah, that's what I figured. I found it very odd, but nonetheless, I thought I would go ahead and
yeah,
share
that's
with you what they're trying to spiel.
yeah, that's one of the biggest, most provable falsehoods that you could stand in front of the American people and say, there's no fucking way that we don't know on any given day where they're at. Now, what is true is in many cases, as we've seen play out in Condor and Gladio, is they will set up camps along the border of Iraq. Now, if a convoy goes on a mission in Syria that day, could there be 30 more Americans in Syria on that given day when they're actually at a location, a deployed location in Iraq? Absolutely. But you know the amount of Americans that you have stationed or you have deployed to a location. You also know where all of those locations are around the border of Syria. And so on any given day, you're going to have a very minimum of the ones that are in Syria and a maximum of all of the ones that are surrounding it, because those people could be on daytime, nighttime missions into the country of Syria. So you have a maximum and a minimum number. And they know that. They know it. There's literally a button you can push on a deployed Persco computer system that spits out the name and social security of every one of those people, because that's how you account for casualties and everything else. So that's horse shit. But thank you for bringing it up.
It's sad how easy they think, like how they've been able to get away with the bullshit they've spewed.
Absolutely.
To the American people is ridiculous. But thank you so much.
Sure. Ron, go ahead.
I just want to say, you don't sound crazy at all, Colonel. And but I understand the sentiment of, sounding crazy to people who don't think like we do. But I just want to say, don't ever question yourself and make yourself you.
No, I'm not saying
you're the most sane person I know.
I'm not questioning myself. I am saying,
I get that. I'm just poking a little fun at you. That's
but I know when I talk to friends that I went to, like elementary school with, sometimes even when as much as my husband knows, when I bring him some new thing I just stumbled over, because I'm very cognizant of, and I think this comes from being a career military person. So let me just tell you a story because it puts it in perspective. Being a Tom girl, being in maintenance, working on airplanes, working on cars, blah, 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 I have a very different set of interests. And you guys have gotten to know me a little bit. I love sports, and I can talk fluent in anything sports. My two sisters, up until fairly recently, had zero interest in anything sports. They were not at all. And it's not that they're, they can't talk about it. It's just that they have zero interest in it. So, I came home probably about 5 years after I was in the military. And of course I come home at least once a year, and you quickly realize that all of your military specific knowledge has no application in civilian life at all. None of the acronyms translate, nothing. And so you immediately start talking in a completely different way to civilian family members about, you can't say that I went TDY, which is how you describe going on a business trip. You say you went on a business trip. So you become a automatic translator from one culture to another culture. So that's just a built-in second nature thing once you've been in the military for several years. Well, I came home and I was sitting at the original Red Lobster, which is in Lakeland, Florida, by the way. It's not there anymore, but we were sitting there eating lunch, and two of our school friends were there with us. So there's 5 girls. They're sitting at the table. They're having a conversation. I'm not participating in the conversation because frankly, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. They're talking about these men's names, but they're not talking about them as if they're men. They're talking about something like in a foreign language. I have no idea what they're talking about. And so this went on for like 20 minutes and I got done eating and I was like, what the hell are y'all talking about? And my sister looked at me like I was retarded. And she said, we're talking about pocketbooks. I said, you're talking about purses? You spent 30 minutes. That just fascinated me. I'm like, how the hell can you talk about purses for 30 minutes, number one? And number two, you talked about purses for 30 minutes and never mentioned the word purse. So to me, they look like they were crazy. They're talking about men and these names of men, and they were actually talking about purses. And to me, that was like the most stupid, moronic thing that I could have ever imagined in my life. I'd never heard of any of them. So I'm very conscious of the communication gaps in. So when I come up with this research and we talk amongst ourselves, when you then try to translate that into someone who doesn't have our background, I'm very conscious because as I'm talking, I'm translating in my head. And if you could visualize it, there's like a million cattle on one side, and I've got to figure out how to get that million cattle through the gate onto the other side. And the entire time you're taking one by one by one through the gate in order to get them up to speed on the fact that there's a million more of them over here. You're looking at the million and you're going, this is freaking crazy. They're never going to believe there's a million more because I lost them on number 3. So yeah, I'm very conscious, and I say that in a self kind of awareness of understanding how everybody that's on the receiving end of this feels, because I feel like it every day. And I deal with it every day. And so I know it's a fire hose for someone who, number one, doesn't have my background, and number two, has not gotten all of the additional details, because I'm really just giving you the 30,000 foot look. So yeah, it's
well, I can absolutely appreciate everything you just said.
Yeah.
And, I think you and I are probably similar from the respect that I don't. I can do small chit chat with people, but I'm way more interested in talking about things that are expanding my brain and talking about things that are in the clandestine world, and reading some of these books and things like that. To me, that's much more fascinating because real life is way more interesting than make believe. And sitting down and I like you. I love baseball, and I can talk baseball all day long, but you're not going to get me talking about lacrosse because I don't know anything about lacrosse, or you're not going to hear me talking about purses or men's fashion and stuff like that, because that's not something that I really care about. So I can absolutely understand and appreciate what you just said there.
Yeah.
And just like you, I also acknowledge that a lot of the things I say to the layperson can be construed as, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so I get that. So, and that was why it struck a chord with me,
Yeah.
what you said. So,
yeah,
anyway.
Absolutely. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, something you said about the government harnessing the Nazis after World War II. There are some questions about whether that the whole Nazi thing was CIA, British, and a couple things point to that. One is that they killed Himmler, the British, and they say he suicided, but basically he was the Nazi intelligence guy. So he knew where the bodies were buried. And the other thing is this weird, I'd never seen them before on X, but they just tweeted something at a thread I was in with you about Skorzeny being actually the CIA before the war, and that someone married Tesla's relative. It's so convoluted. I didn't get a chance. It just happened hours ago, and I didn't get a chance to read the whole document. But so fucking bizarre. And it's like, yeah, okay, if we live in a world like that, yeah. I mean, if I said that to somebody, they would think I was crazy. But I'm like, huh? Yeah, because I know what they did to Tesla. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in.
So I have not had the chance with all of these podcasts I've done today to look at whatever you're talking about. I'll be happy to look at it and address it. Obviously, Skorzeny didn't have anything to do with the CIA before World War II because there was no CIA.
Well, I know they're just pointing at the CIA, but the British, they're fucking crazy, man. They're just really crazy. And I wouldn't put it past them for 1 second.
Well, the British and the oligarchs in New York funded Hitler, and they funded the Bolshevik Revolution. So there's plenty of ties there. We went over early on in this whole conversation months ago about that weird Mitford family that had the 5 women, one of which was Hitler's girlfriend. The other one married Oswald Mosley, which was part of the British Round Table, Fabian Society, blah, blah, blah. And so there are lots of links there to pursue in, but at this point, I tend to only talk about the things that I can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's a lot of things that you could speculate happened because there's a body of evidence that would suggest that, but I tend to stay away from that because there's so much other stuff that's real. But anyway,
Can I say one more thing about that?
Sure.
So I studied history, and there was a report that when World War I was starting, all of those monarchs were actually relatives. And at one point, which I didn't know, at one point they were like realizing that fucking World War I was starting, and they were all just standing in a room like crying together because I guess they didn't know how to stop it. But I had no idea they were all relatives.
So that didn't just start in World War I, obviously. They intermarried. If you go back to the whole Joan of Arc and, the 1600s, the 1700s, Catherine the Great from Russia. I mean, most of the Tsar family was intermarried between the Germans, the British, and then half the time, if you look at the this just blew my mind that at any one time, one person can be the king of Spain, France, and England. And then because of the way the lineage works, like England, women can be in that chain, but in other countries they can't. And so then you will have the next generation to a king of France and Spain, but it was actually supposed to be the woman, but she couldn't assume the throne in those other 2 countries, so she's only now the queen of England, and the second person gets to assume the throne of France, and then they marry this person in Germany, and then they marry the person in Holland, and blah, blah, blah. So they're all interbred, which is why they're all crazy. SR-71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. For those of you that didn't catch the Colonel's show earlier today with Ryan, I did catch it, and I was watching on Rumble, Colonel. And the more the show went on, I was wondering when, if ever, we were going to get to child trafficking, but it never did. That aside, you're right. Every time you said something, not only was Ryan looking something up, you got this look of astonishment from him. It was like, really?
Yeah.
So that really got to me. But then again, there's other things I'm looking at here as well. Oliver North, when we get to Iran-Contra, as NSC, Oliver North was involved in a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, much more than just Iran-Contra, which was his major calling. But it just amazes me what this man got into.
Yeah, he's another one that I don't think was.
Yeah, he was part of the Libya bombing. He was in Contra.
Well, if you've ever, when we first started talking about the Iran-Contra on Alpha's show, you know, Alpha had to go rescue him. One of Alpha's Marine missions in Afghanistan after 9/11 he was told in the briefing that there was a civilian film crew in Afghanistan that had gotten stranded in a crossfire and that their mission was to go rescue him, and he picked up Oliver North. So
yeah, I remember that, Colonel. That was a story to tell.
Yeah. So I'm telling Alpha all of the shit that Oliver North was in, and he's got this shocked face, and he's like, Colonel, you're never going to believe this. And I'm like, yeah, now you tell me what the hell is Oliver North doing in the middle of Afghanistan in a hot war filming a documentary? That's horseshit. That is not why he was there.
And one final thing I'll back you up on, Colonel, is while I was stationed at Headquarters Marine Corps here at the Navy Annex, I worked on the table of manpower requirements. So you know where everybody's at.
Yes.
Nobody gets lost.
Yes. Absolutely. Warhamster, did you come up because you wanted to say something?
I did.
Okay.
Hey, everyone. Regarding the bloodlines and the nobility, it's obviously an inexact science because records weren't perfect during the Dark Ages, but probably the best research I've seen traces an awful lot of the noble families back to what they call the Black nobility, 13 families from Venice. Well, those Venetian families are descended from the nobility of Rome. I don't think we have a paper trail or much documentation, but some of the families go back even before that. And there's been a lot of intermixing, a lot of inbreeding, everything like that. But the big curveball was thrown when we created a new class of people in around the 16th century, and you had all of a sudden these incredibly rich merchant class, and they were able to buy their way in to some degree into, shall we say, polite society. British East India Company being the first example you see in England, the Dutch East India Company. But once you had wealth outside of the nobles, it kind of watered down the tree a little bit. But even back then, if your family came into money in the 1600s, you're considered new money, not old money, and there is a difference.
Yeah, a big difference, and thanks for bringing that up, because old money never really accepts new money.
Oh, they'll accept the money. They'll just do it.
No. I'm talking about the people.
They take your money.
I'm talking about the people.
Yeah, I know. But
the people representing old money never accepts in fully the people representing new money.
Yeah, you see that with the bought titles. People that donate enough money, you get a title in England. That kind of stuff. Or some kind of entrepreneur or industrialist becomes a sir. Gets knighted. They're still not considered in the same social class as somebody who's born to it.
Correct. Yeah. And it's funny to hear them talk because like in listening to recordings of these people talking, they're very disdainful of, and they do it in kind of that subtle way where they're insulting you, but it sounds like they're complimenting you at the same time. They're very good at that.
Oh yeah, Yeah, up this polite as all heck, but at the same time, they're still talking down their nose at you.
Correct. Trump Frog, go ahead.
Hey, what's up, Colonel? What's up, Bridget? What's up, SR? What's up, Warhamster and everybody else? When you were talking about old money not accepting new money, it just hit me. When I worked for Nike Golf, I remember the richest person in the world at the time was Bill Gates. He was trying to be a member of Augusta National Golf Club where they play the Masters. They would not make him a member because he was considered new money.
Yeah.
And those Southern folk were like, I do not think so. We don't want you. Well, he's a dork anyway, but so I thought I'd throw up there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that plays out in some of those venues like that as well. And what I have noticed is that kind of like it's so funny that you bring that up. The Southern moneyed families obviously are not as plentiful as the Northern ones, but they have their own hierarchy and they know that they're never going to be accepted by the Northern ones, which makes them almost more ruthless. Just because it's, I don't even know what the word is, but because they don't have anything, they know they're never going to be in that upper class. And so they're ruthlessly in the class right below it. And I have had the opportunity in some of the venues that I've been at as a senior officer where some of that, because we have to do civic engagement, and there are some of these people, like when I was in Georgia, that would come into these meetings with senior military, like you'd have the 4-star, the 3-star, couple 2 stars, and then the directorate level, which is what I was at. And you'd have dinner, and again, they call it civic engagement. And some of these people, and of course, I looked everybody up. There's a guest list. I wanted to know who was going to be there. I'm not the most refined person in the world, so I tend to not say anything in those settings. I just watch everybody, but I wanted to know. I had pictures of everybody in my little book. I knew where they came from, how they made their money. I did my homework. And so when they started talking, I very interestingly could put things into context. And it's funny because some of my other fellow colonels, we'd be off over at our own private little table. And I go, did you hear so-and-so say that? And she looks at me and she's like, I didn't hear that. What? How do you know that? And I'm like, because I looked them all up. I wanted to know. It was quite, and they're ruthless. I mean, but in a very nice way. Like bless your heart means kiss my ass. But anyway, crazy times.
You got me with the bless your heart.
That's like the word dude. So I had a guy that worked for me at CENTCOM that could use the word dude in about 25 different ways. And he had a whole like comedian skit, like, dude, what's going on? Or dude. And he did the whole thing. I'm not any good at it. I'm not a comedian, but he was very, very good at it. And he just went through this whole routine. Bless your heart's like that. You could actually mean bless your heart, or you could mean kiss my ass. I hope you drop dead. Yeah, it's the go-to when you really don't like somebody, but you don't want to sound like you don't like them. Bless your heart is very, very good.
I thought bless their heart was they're retarded.
It has multiple meanings. It has multiple meanings, Carrie. That's what I'm saying. You can use it in a multitude of different ways.
Absolutely. And I have used sex words.
Yes.
On the same note, I just wanted to interject because I accidentally stumbled across this yesterday. Since you were talking about the intermarriage of royals, from what I understand, the Queen Mother, who just passed away, was actually first cousin with her husband. So there you go.
Yeah,
it's not something that's not still being practiced. This is normal to them.
Yes, and unfortunately, that's not all that rare.
And it's encouraged. That's the crazy thing. And we went down that in the very early, before we really got hooked up into Gladio, or before I did. I went down that rabbit hole, and it was a lot of the wealthy families, the DuPonts, the so on and so forth. It was encouraged. It was encouraged in an extreme way to marry your cousin. And actually, they ended up with fertility issues, according to historical documents, which they control. So who knows if that's actually true? But and there was a lot of that's a deep, dark, long, twisted, screwed up rabbit hole.
Well, and a lot of times they do it to keep the money in the family too. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. They did not want to share any of that power or allow anyone to infiltrate. And that's kind of the same scenario they do now.
Yeah. All right. I think we got all the hands done. I appreciate you guys sticking with me throughout the day. Today was a marathon day. We only have one tomorrow, and hopefully that will be with Isabella at 4. Otherwise, we'll get another chapter knocked out and be on our way to finishing this book because we're almost done. So thanks everybody for being here. And if you guys are not able, if you're traveling this weekend or whatever, please have a blessed and a Merry Christmas. I will say that at the end of each one from now until then, because I don't know when you guys will be here and when you won't. And I just want to make sure everybody has a Merry Christmas. So, all right. Thanks everybody for being here. See you tomorrow. What?
Just one thing, Colonel.
Sure.
If everybody would please give a like, share, that would be great. I also, Colonel, I know you don't watch TV that much, but there's a series out there. If you want to know about the way old money treats new money, it's called The Gilded Age on HBO.
Okay. So somebody just posted Nick Fluente survived an assassination attempt. That's crazy. Said the suspect was killed and 3 other were killed as well. I'm telling you guys, it's going to be totally crazy for the next few weeks. But anyway. All right.
We're in Capricorn, and that's Saturn. Saturn eats his children.
Well, on that happy note, thank you, Carrie. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. All right, guys, let's get off of here. Thank you again for being here and having patience. Greetings from Australia. Oh, we got another Australia. Awesome. We have so many Swedish followers and Australians. Love you all. Thank you for being here. Merry Christmas. And I will see you tomorrow. Take care.